Horror punk is a small, very specific branch of the punk family tree, and it's the branch I'll be talking about today, with a little crossover to some closely related branches, so closely that it's often hard to tell which branch is which. This video is going to cover 6 albums that'll help you get started in exploring horror punk. I'm Michael, and this is Eclecticism, Halloween edition. Yeah, I know there's still like a month before Halloween, but Halloween's the best holiday.
It's always Halloween in my soul.
So a few caveats before we launch into this. I'm obviously not going to cover everything. This isn't going to be a comprehensive history. It's more like a quick introduction with a set of starting points you can look at if you want to explore more. And at the end, I'll have some honorable mentions of some other artists that I think are worth checking out. If there's more elements of the history that you want to help fill out in the comments section, or if you want to talk about some other bands that were left out of this video, please do. Because down the road, humans of the future, they could look at this video and they could find out even more from the comments that you left. So first, let's quickly look over how horror punk got started. Horror punk came about after punk, but you can trace its roots earlier. Screamin' Jay Hawkins merged horror tropes with his mix of rhythm and soul. Skulls and witch doctors in black cloaks. I'm sure you've heard his iconic version of I Put a Spell on You. You also have horror imagery adopted by bands like Black Sabbath and Black Widow. One of those bands was obviously a little more influential than the other, but Black Widow put on some seriously bizarre shows where they acted out satanic sacrifices on stage. Later bands before punk explored a horror aesthetic as well, like Alice Cooper and Kiss. Then we get to punk. You have an early punk band called The Damned, and their singer, David Vanian, took his style from old horror films, specifically the look of Bela Lugosi's Dracula, and was an influence on the future goth subculture, along with his baritone vocal style also influencing goth. But the first band with all the necessary elements, horror and punk, was the Cramps, and they're the first band on this list. With a horror-looking logo, lyrics that sound like the plots of campy B-movies, and a sound that combined punk and garage rock with rockabilly, a style that they once called psychobilly on some of their promotional materials, and the name then stuck and became its own genre. I know they're not typically thought of as horror punk, but I do find this kind of strange considering they're the first band that clearly mixed these horror movie elements with punk sounds. At the very least, you have to call them very influential on the genre and one of the proto-horror punk bands. The 2 ongoing members of the band were Poison Ivy Rorschach and Lux Interior, a married couple with a shared love for obscure rockabilly 7 inches and tacky horror films. They wanted to merge these interests. Poison Ivy's heavy surf and rockabilly guitar playing, along with Lux Interior's spastic and bizarre performances, the over-the-top spooky / retro / horny lyrics, all of it added up to a totally unique band that's beloved by punks and goths alike, and they're a band you should definitely explore. So my first rec for this video is the Cramps' Songs the Lord Taught Us. This is some stripped-down punk that includes elements of rockabilly. From the first song, TV Set, we hear Lux singing about how he's going to decorate his home with the parts of your body, and things stay that weird for the album's duration. We have rockabilly oldies, reanimated and turned up to a panicked pace. We have songs about teenage werewolves and zombies, and the aesthetic of B-horror films oozing from the chugging guitars. You can't talk about horror punk without recognizing the importance of the Cramps, and if you want to learn more about this band, I recommend keeping an eye on this channel. Speaking of important, influential bands, for our second band, let's have a look at the band that really started the whole horror punk thing. The Misfits combined horror imagery and lyrics with a punk sound, showing a more aggressive approach to horror punk. Like the Cramps, many of their songs are named after vintage horror films, and the artwork reflects horror themes. The Misfits' Crimson Ghost logo is now well known, even to those outside the world of punk. They had an iconic look as well. The Misfits invented their own hairstyle, the devil lock, where the sides are short and the hair is combed forward, often to a point. Glenn Danzig, vocalist and songwriter, said his hairdo was inspired by the look of Eddie Munster from the TV show The Munsters. Jerry Only said his was inspired by a tidal wave hairstyle sported by skateboarders in the 70s. The Misfits' lyrics were more violent and graphic than the Cramps, without the humor either, often going more for extreme shock value. Glenn Danzig would go on a whole career of horror-themed music, which moved further and further from punk as time went on. The original Misfits era, in my mind, is a perfect run of albums, but his following band, Sam Hain, is also excellent. The Misfits without Danzig did release some more albums throughout the 90s, and some since then. They've more recently actually toured with Danzig in the band again. I know there were a lot of hard feelings between Glenn Danzig and Jerry Only. I don't know how much those have been patched up, or if they're just working together because they can make more money doing it that way. Either way, I'm not really anticipating a new Misfits album coming anytime soon. So my second pick, I recommend listening to the Misfits' Walk Among Us. This was their first album to be released, even though some earlier material has later surfaced on a comp called Static Age. Even with the intensity of it, the Misfits always seemed like a very catchy band to me. Even though the first album I got by them was Earth AD Wolf's Blood, which is the hardest one they put out, they just write catchy choruses. They write things you can sing along with and that are really memorable and stick in your head, even though they're pretty much blistering fast. I'd say that if you're a fan of punk at all, you should at least be familiar with this album, whether or not they end up becoming one of your favorite bands or not. But if you're getting into horror punk, they're pretty much the essential band. So horror punk is one of many genres that are related in some way to the genre of horror, and there was a lot of crossover between horror punk and a genre called death rock in the 80s, when these genres were both much newer and more nebulous. Death rock was a descendant of goth, but with more of a punk and sometimes industrial influence. I'm bringing this up because when you look at the 80s, there are some bands that were considered part of both these scenes, even though they might not sound quite like what you'd picture horror punk sounding like now. Our third band is one of those bands. 45 Grave formed in 1979, and their first release was a cover of an old horror novelty song from the 60s. Their lightly punkified version of riboflavin-flavored, non-carbonated polyunsaturated blood, wisely shortened to riboflavin, became a hit for them, and was followed up by some other dark songs that merged punk with hard rock and horror themes. They're best known now for the song Party Time, which had a few different versions, and one of them was the theme song for one of the best movies ever, Return of the Living Dead. This song is fucking weird. The verses are a horrific story about the terrible things that happen to a 5-year-old girl, and they're a bit too edgy for a YouTube video without a trigger warning. You get to the chorus and they're just like, "Do you want to party? It's party time." After that story you just told me? No. My third recommendation is their album Sleep in Safety. This has a lot of variety, and goes beyond just punk, but it was a really influential album on earlier horror punk, and on the sound that would become death rock. The album has a wide range of music, even a ballad, but the punk influence is obvious in the vocal delivery by the perfectly named Dinah Cancer, in the adoption of their fast-paced surf rock riffs in some of the songs, and in the spooky mood they maintain for much of the album. However, don't go into this one expecting straight-up Ramones-sounding punk. It's definitely not a perfect album. I feel like it's kind of uneven because it tries to do so many different things, and it does a lot of them well, but the fact that it does so many makes it so that it doesn't really have a consistent atmosphere from beginning to end. So some parts feel like creepy horror punk, some parts are just ballads and kind of doing a different thing. Despite that little criticism, it is an album that always seems to come into my rotation when Halloween starts getting close, because it's got so many songs that I just associate with this time of year. And it was super influential. Okay, so that's 3 early albums that were influential on the style's early development. Now let's jump ahead to the late 90s. AFI, short for A Fire Inside, formed in California. They began as a skate punk band, but were way too talented to stay in one place for long. They quickly evolved into a hardcore band, then had a horror punk phase that lasted 2 albums and an EP after that. From there, they made a hugely successful transition into a gothy alternative rock space, where they topped the charts briefly with Miss Murder. They've continued evolving ever since without ever losing their punk credibility. They're a phenomenal band, they're incredibly talented, they've done a lot of really good stuff. A lot of punk fans consider this horror punk era their high point because at this point their songwriting had gotten more complex, more dark, more emotional. But at the same time, I really do encourage you to look at more of the band's discography than this if they're a band you haven't explored. Their earlier hardcore stuff I quite like too, and I really like the albums that came after this where they started bringing in a little bit more goth and a little bit more alternative rock sounds. They're also really good. Unlike the campiness of the earlier bands we've discussed, the darkness of AFI's music was more romantic, dramatic. This wasn't B-movie horror, this was Interview with a Vampire horror. It was lush and beautiful in its darkness, but it accomplished this while still clearly being hardcore. So my fourth horror punk recommendation is their 5th album, The Art of Drowning. It really is a toss-up with Black Sails in the Sunset. I feel some Misfits influence in the vocals, and you definitely still call some of this music hardcore, but it's some of the smoothest, most melodic hardcore that you could hope for. It's one of those albums that's focused on the darker emotions, yet it always puts me in a good mood because it's so full of emotion, so full of energy, and just the sheer talent of the band. For me, The Art of Drowning is a great entry point into AFI's catalog, and once you have explored that, I would also really recommend trying out the All Hallows EP, and it's perfect for this time of year. Now let's head to Osaka, Japan, where a band has been keeping it creepy since the mid-90s. Balzac released their first album in 1995, and they've focused on horror punk ever since. I'm assuming this is where Phoebe Bridgers got the idea for her Punisher skeleton outfit. They're a very popular band in Japan, and have often opened for Misfits when they're touring Japan. Balzac and Misfits have even collaborated on music together. Here they are with Jerry Only. Balzac's had many lineup changes over the years, with the band orbiting around the one constant member, Hirosuke Nishiyama. Sorry again, I'm an American, I speak one language, but I have degrees in that language. Musically, Balzac embraces more than just the sound of horror punk. They also embrace the whole marketing aspect of the Misfits, the imagery. They have merch, fashion lines. They actually have their own shop, and multiple lines of Balzac toys that have come out over the years. Also, I'm going to be upfront about something else. Before I started doing research for this video, I'd literally never heard of this one. They're a very new discovery for me, and I'm bringing them up so you have the chance to check them out, because as soon as I heard them, I started getting excited about them. I'll recommend an album, but I honestly don't really know if this is the best entry point. I just know that for me, it worked as a really good one. I recommend their 7th album, Came Out of the Grave. It has Misfits energy, but it stretches beyond this with riffage that feels metal, and textures that feel industrial at times. The production is gritty and fuzzy, with the vocals sometimes sounding like they're coming through a imperfect phone line or something. But it's a furiously paced, fun punk album. I guess the one criticism I have is that some of the songs feel a little bit long for punk songs, but that's really all the negative that I have to say about it. I have no idea what the lyrics are, but this is instrumentally so engaging that I don't really care, and it still feels very Misfits, very horror. I recommend you check this band out, and this album is a really decent starting point. So now we're hopping back to America again. This video is very America heavy. I did try out a couple Russian bands, and I just wasn't getting into them, and I found one supposedly horror punk band from Mexico, but I decided they sounded a bit more goth than horror punk, even though they're quite good. So for the next band, we're heading to West Virginia in the USA. Blitzkid started in 1997 because they wanted to make music they could skate to. Either they wanted to skate to some fairly dark shit, or they just developed a lot in the first few years and moved toward a horror punk sound. They go a little bit more pop punk than a lot of the other bands on this list as well, making this feel more accessible than Balzac and a little bit less frenetic than AFI. I don't mean pop punk in a negative sense either, I just mean this is entertaining and fast-paced punk that's always fun and spooky. I could recommend any of several great albums from this band. They were very consistent, but I'm going to go with their Let Flowers Die album. This is such a fun album, with singer TB Monstrosity giving his vocals a vibe that feels retro but distinct from other horror punk vocalists. It's still a croon that harkens back to that earlier rock and roll rockabilly sound, but it doesn't sound like an imitation of Danzig's croon. It's very distinct. They only occasionally use the call and response vocals popularized by Misfits, and that have been used by most of the other bands on this list. It feels like a more subtle take musically on the horror material, and I find this an excellent album. But one reason Blitzkid was chosen for this video is because they've been remarkably consistent across all of their albums, and even the compilations of their rarities released much later are excellent. So start with Let Flowers Die, but if you like that, definitely do not stop there. So there you go. 6 horror punk bands to help you start immersing yourself in this genre, dip your toe in a little bit. If you have other recommendations for people getting into horror punk, please, like I said, do leave them in the comments. I love seeing the bands that come through in the comments, and I read every one and try and listen to the music that's coming through there as well. But before I wrap this up, I do have a handful of honorable mentions of some other great bands that I just didn't have time to dive into. Schoolyard Heroes, a Washington band that blended horror punk with some post-hardcore elements, and made 3 good albums before disbanding. Calabrese, I hope I'm saying that right, are a Phoenix, Arizona horror punk band that formed in 2002 and is still going today. They have one of the most consistently fun discographies you're going to find in horror punk. And someone would definitely yell at me in the comments if I didn't recommend you check out Tiger Army, particularly Power of Moonlight and Ghost Tiger's Rise. They're both excellent, and I do recommend checking them out, even though they didn't quite make my top 5. And lastly, Zombina and the Skeletones. This hooky and poppy horror punk band from Liverpool is so much fun. Zombina's voice is great for the style of music that they do, and they just started recording and releasing music again after a bit of a hiatus. If you enjoyed this and want to hear me gush about music some more, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode.